Letters to Friend and Foe by Baruch Spinoza. Quotes. Letters to Friend and Foe by Baruch Spinoza provides insight into the philosopher's personal correspondences, offering a unique perspective on his thoughts and the challenges he faced during his life. These letters, written during the last 2 decades of Spinoza's life, capture his interactions with friends, supporters, and opponents, reflecting on themes of philosophy, theology, and human freedom. Spinoza's expulsion from Amsterdam's Jewish community and the broader European perception of him as a dangerous thinker shaped his work, including the formation of his ideas on God, nature, and human conduct. Quote 1. I will then begin by speaking briefly of God, whom I define as a being consisting in infinite attributes, whereof each is infinite or supremely perfect, after its kind. Spinoza introduces his conception of God as an entity characterized by infinite attributes, each representing the utmost perfection within its scope. This definition underpins his philosophical framework in Ethics, where he posits that God's nature encompasses all conceivable perfections, challenging traditional monotheistic views by equating God with the universe itself, thus advancing a form of pantheism. This approach aims to dissolve the perceived separateness between deity and the natural world, asserting that everything that exists is a manifestation of God's essence. Quote 2. The first and the greatest error is that these philosophers have strayed so far from the knowledge of the first cause and origin of all things. The second is that they did not know the true nature of the human mind. The third, that they never grasped the true cause of error. Spinoza critiques his predecessors, particularly Descartes and Bacon, for their epistemological errors, their inadequate understanding of the origin of existence, the nature of the human mind, and the roots of error. He contends that these misunderstandings lead to a flawed philosophical and scientific inquiry. By emphasizing these points, Spinoza advocates for a philosophy that is more aligned with a comprehensive understanding of nature and existence, where knowledge is grounded in the interconnectivity and inherent rationality of the universe. Quote 3. As regards miracles, I am of opinion that the revelation of God can only be established by the wisdom of the doctrine, not by miracles, or in other words, by ignorance. Here, Spinoza dismisses the validity of miracles as evidence of divine intervention, arguing instead that true knowledge of God comes from understanding the inherent order and rationality of the world. He criticizes the reliance on miracles as fostering ignorance by encouraging belief without understanding. This stance is central to his rationalistic approach, emphasizing that enlightenment and spirituality are achieved through intellectual and ethical development rather than mystical or supernatural experiences. Quote 4. God I in no wise subject to fate. I conceive that all things follow with inevitable necessity from the nature of God, in the same way as everyone conceives that it follows from God's nature that God understands himself. Spinoza's assertion that God and fate are not interlinked, but that everything unfolds from divine nature with necessity, challenges traditional views of free will and divine providence. He posits a universe governed by immutable laws derived from God's nature, suggesting that understanding these laws is akin to understanding God itself. This perspective frames fate not as a series of arbitrary events imposed by a deity, but as the natural consequence of the universe's underlying order. Quote 5. Your long absence has been no less grievous to me than to you. Yet, in the meantime, I rejoice that my trifling studies are of profit to you and our friends. Spinoza expresses personal sentiment regarding the distance between himself and his correspondent, Simon de Vries, highlighting the emotional impact of their separation. He also reflects a sense of satisfaction that his philosophical inquiries, modestly described as trifling studies, provide value to his friends. This underscores the importance Spinoza places on shared intellectual endeavors and the mutual enrichment of knowledge among peers. Quote 6. You need not envy my fellow lodger. There is no one who is more displeasing to me, nor against whom I have been more anxiously on my guard. Here, Spinoza reassures De Vries regarding his feelings toward another acquaintance, emphasizing a cautious and guarded stance. This statement reveals Spinoza's careful approach to relationships and his awareness of the potential influences and dynamics within his social circle, particularly in relation to his philosophical work and ideas. Quote 7. I see that your difficulties arise from not distinguishing between kinds of definition, that is, between a definition serving to explain a thing, of which the essence only is sought and in question, and a definition which is put forward only for purposes of inquiry. Spinoza addresses a conceptual confusion apparent in De Vries's questions, clarifying the distinction between different types of definitions used in philosophical discourse. He points out the necessity of understanding whether a definition is meant to elucidate the essence of a thing or merely to facilitate further investigation. This distinction is crucial for proper philosophical analysis and avoids misunderstandings that might arise from the imprecise use of terms. Quote 8. Hence, a definition either explains a thing, insofar as it is external to the intellect, in which case it ought to be true, and only to differ from a proposition or an axiom in being concerned merely with the essences of things or the modifications of things, whereas the latter has a wider scope and extends also to eternal truths. This quote elaborates on the nature of definitions, describing them as either externally true statements about the essence of things or as conceptual tools that extend to broader philosophical truths. Spinoza elucidates the role of definitions in structuring philosophical thought, highlighting their foundational place in constructing and conveying complex ideas. Quote 9. If I say that each substance has only one attribute, this is an unsupported statement and needs proof. But if I say that I mean by substance that which consists in only one attribute, the definition will be good, so long as entities consisting of several attributes are afterward styled by some name other than substance. Spinoza illustrates the importance of clarity in philosophical assertions and definitions, using the concept of substance to demonstrate how definitions can shape the understanding of a concept. This example underscores the precision needed in philosophical language to avoid confusion and ensure that discussions are grounded in clearly defined terms. Quote 10. Everyone regards the question of the infinite as most difficult, if not insoluble, through not making a distinction between that which must be infinite from its very nature, or in virtue of its definition, and that which has no limits, not in virtue of its essence, but in virtue of its cause. Spinoza delves into the concept of the infinite, which he perceives as often misunderstood due to the lack of critical distinctions among different types of infinities. By highlighting these distinctions, he suggests that a clearer understanding of the infinite is attainable, which is crucial for grasping the foundational elements of reality as he sees them. This introduction sets the stage for a detailed analysis aimed at resolving common confusions surrounding the infinite. Quote 11. The modifications of substance I call modes. Their definition, insofar as it is not identical with that of substance, cannot involve any existence. In this explanation, Spinoza defines modes as the modifications or states of a substance, distinct in their lack of independent existence outside the substance itself. This clarification is central to his philosophical framework, where everything concrete in the universe is a mode of either thought or extension, which are attributes of a single underlying substance. Quote 12. Hence, though they exist, we can conceive them as non-existent. Here, Spinoza suggests that while modes exist, our mental conception of them can include their non-existence, demonstrating the dependency of modes on substance for their existence. This philosophical stance underlines the transient nature of modes as opposed to the constancy of substance, which exists necessarily by itself. Quote 13. From what has been said, it is quite clear that when, as is most often the case, we are regarding only the essence of modes, and not the order of nature, we may freely limit the existence and duration of modes without destroying the conception we have formed of them. Spinoza points out that our understanding of modes can be conceptually manipulated in terms of existence and duration without altering their essential nature. This flexibility in conceptualizing modes reflects the inherent power of human cognition to abstract and categorize experiences beyond their immediate manifestations. Quote 14. It is not to be wondered at, therefore, that all who have endeavored to understand the course of nature by means of such notions, and without fully understanding even them, have entangled themselves so wondrously that they have at last only been able to extricate themselves by breaking through every rule and admitting absurdities even of the grossest kind. Spinoza criticizes the misuse of abstract concepts such as time and measure by those attempting to grasp the nature of reality without a proper understanding of these tools themselves. He argues that this often leads to paradoxes and logical absurdities, underscoring the need for a disciplined approach to philosophical inquiry that respects the limits and proper applications of conceptual abstractions. Quote 15. Your last letter, written, if I mistake not, on the 26th of last month, has duly reached me. It caused me no small sorrow and solicitude, though the feeling sensibly diminished when I reflected on the good sense and fortitude with which you have known how to despise the evils of fortune, or rather of opinion, at a time when they most bitterly assailed you. Spinoza expresses his emotional response to a letter from his friend Peter Balling, acknowledging the distress it caused him and the comfort he found in Balling's resilience. This quote highlights the depth of Spinoza's personal relationships and his philosophical outlook on overcoming life's challenges by focusing on reason and inner strength rather than succumbing to external misfortunes. Quote 16. I should judge that these were not real groans, but only the effect of your imagination. For you say that, when you got up and composed yourself to listen, you did not hear them so clearly either as before or as afterward, when you had fallen asleep again. In this passage, Spinoza addresses the phenomenon of hearing groans, which his friend interpreted as an omen. He suggests that these sounds were figments of the imagination, influenced by the state of being between sleep and wakefulness. Spinoza uses this explanation to underline the influence of mental states on perception and to caution against attributing supernatural significance to such experiences. Quote 17. This, I think, shows that the groans were purely due to the imagination, which, when it was unfettered and free, could imagine groans more forcibly and vividly than when you sat up in order to listen in a particular direction. Here, Spinoza elaborates on how imagination can create vivid experiences that are not rooted in external reality, especially when the mind is not focused or directed. He points out that the intensity of the imagined groans decreased when his friend actively tried to listen for them, suggesting that imagination is more potent when it operates without constraint. Quote 18. It may, therefore, imagine a future event as forcibly and vividly as though it were present. For instance, a father loves his child so much that he and the beloved child are, as it were, one and the same. Spinoza speculates that intense love could create a mental and emotional union so strong that the experiences of the loved one are almost directly felt by the lover. This deep connection, he argues, could enable the father to experience a kind of presentiment of significant events affecting the child, blurring the line between imagination and intuition about the future. Quote 19. I received, at Schiedam, on the 26th of December, your letter dated the 12th of December, enclosed in another written on the 24th of the same month. I gather from it your fervent love of truth, and your making it the aim of all your studies. Spinoza acknowledges the receipt of Blyenberg's letters and commends his dedication to pursuing truth. This introduction sets a tone of mutual respect and shared intellectual curiosity, emphasizing Spinoza's appreciation for sincere inquiry and the value he places on correspondence as a means to explore philosophical questions. Quote 20. So far as in me lies, I value, above all other things out of my own control, the joining hands of friendship with men who are sincere lovers of truth. Here, Spinoza expresses his high regard for forming friendships based on a shared love of truth, highlighting this as one of the greatest external goods one can attain. He sees these relationships as a source of peace and a means to foster intellectual growth, suggesting that such connections are based on enduring principles rather than fleeting interests. Quote 21. For my own part, I cannot admit that sin and evil have any positive existence, far less that anything can exist or come to pass, contrary to the will of God. Spinoza articulates his view that sin and evil do not possess any real, positive existence, but are merely privations or negations of good. This perspective is rooted in his broader metaphysical framework, which asserts that everything that happens is a result of God's will, aligning with his conception of God as an absolutely infinite being whose understanding and will are identical. Quote 22. We know that whatsoever is, when considered in itself without regard to anything else, possesses perfection, extending in each thing as far as the limits of that thing's essence. In this statement, Spinoza argues that everything that exists is perfect to the extent that it expresses its own essence. He challenges conventional notions of good and evil by suggesting that these are relative terms, dependent on comparisons rather than inherent qualities of things themselves. Quote 23. I say that no effects of imagination springing from physical causes can ever be omens of future events, inasmuch as their causes do not involve any future events. Spinoza rejects the idea that events or phenomena that arise from physical causes can serve as omens or predictors of the future. He grounds this assertion in his broader philosophical stance that all effects have causes that are comprehensible within the framework of nature, without the need for supernatural explanations. Quote 24. But the effects of imagination, or images originating in the mental disposition, may be omens of some future event, inasmuch as the mind may have a confused presentiment of the future. In contrast to his previous statement, Spinoza allows for the possibility that mental phenomena, influenced by a person's disposition, might contain some predictive power regarding future events. This opens up a nuanced view of human cognition and its interaction with time, suggesting a complex relationship between mind, imagination, and potential future realities. Quote 25. I cannot refrain from expressing my extreme astonishment at your remarking that if God does not punish wrongdoing, that is, as a judge does, with a punishment not intrinsically connected with the offense, for our whole difference lies in this, what reason prevents me from rushing headlong into every kind of wickedness? Spinoza expresses his surprise at the suggestion that the absence of divine punishment would lead to moral chaos. He argues that true virtue is derived from an inherent nature aligned with the understanding of God, rather than from fear of punishment. This quote highlights his belief in the intrinsic motivation for ethical behavior, rooted in understanding and love of God, rather than external coercion. Quote 26. For my own part, I avoid or endeavor to avoid vice, because it is at direct variance with my proper nature, and would lead me astray from the knowledge and love of God. Here, Spinoza clarifies his personal ethical stance, stating that he avoids vice because it conflicts with his true nature and impedes his spiritual and intellectual communion with God. This statement underscores his philosophical view that living in accordance with one's nature leads to the highest form of happiness and understanding, aligning personal ethics directly with metaphysical truth. Quote 27. Again, if you had reflected a little on human nature and the nature of God's decree, as explained in my appendix, and perceived and known by this time how a consequence should be deduced from its premises before a conclusion is arrived at, you would not so rashly have stated that my opinion makes us like stocks, etc. Spinoza challenges the interpretation that his philosophical views reduce humans to passive entities like plants or inanimate objects. He suggests that a proper understanding of human nature and divine causality would prevent such a misinterpretation. This quote is crucial for clarifying that his deterministic view of the universe does not negate human complexity or value. Quote 28. As to the 2 points which you say, before passing on to your second rule, that you cannot understand, I answer that the first may be solved through Descartes, who says that in observing your own nature, you feel that you can suspend your judgment. Spinoza refers to Descartes to address a misunderstanding about human freedom and judgment. He uses Descartes' philosophy to explain that humans have the capacity to withhold judgment, which is a form of exercising freedom, despite living in a deterministic universe. This elucidation is key to understanding Spinoza's integration of free will within a framework where God is the ultimate cause of all actions. Quote 29. I now pass on to your second rule, and assert that I believe, though I do not ascribe to Scripture that sort of truth which you think you find in it, I nevertheless assign to it as great, if not greater authority, than you do. Spinoza discusses his perspective on the authority of Scripture, clarifying that while he may not interpret biblical texts in the same literal or conventional manner as others might, he still holds them in high regard. He emphasizes a more philosophical and perhaps metaphorical interpretation of religious texts, which is crucial for understanding his approach to integrating philosophy with theology. Quote 30. The demonstration of the unity of God on the ground that his nature involves necessary existence, which you asked for, and I took note of, I have been prevented by various business from sending to you before. Spinoza begins his correspondence with Christian Huygens by addressing the request for a demonstration that God's nature involves necessary existence, indicating the importance of this philosophical issue in their discussions. This statement sets the stage for a detailed argument on the unity and uniqueness of God, underscoring the seriousness with which Spinoza treats the inquiries of his correspondent. Quote 31. That the true definition of anything includes nothing except the simple nature of the thing defined. Here, Spinoza establishes a fundamental principle of his metaphysics, stating that the definition of any entity should capture only its essential nature, without extraneous elements. This principle is crucial for his argument about the unity of God, as it implies that the definition of God must include existence as an essential attribute, leading to the conclusion that God's existence is necessary and singular. Quote 32. If any given number of individuals exists in nature, there must be one or more causes which have been able to produce exactly that number of individuals, neither more nor less. Spinoza argues that the existence of any specific number of entities must be explainable through causes external to those entities, since their individual natures do not dictate the precise quantity that exists. This premise is critical in arguing that if multiple gods existed, there would need to be an external cause explaining why exactly those gods and no others exist, which contradicts the concept of God as a necessarily existent being. Quote 33. But since, by our second hypothesis, necessary existence appertains to the nature of God, his true definition must necessarily include necessary existence. Therefore, from his true definition, his necessary existence must be inferred. Spinoza concludes that God's existence is not just a contingent fact, but is necessitated by his very nature. This conclusion follows logically from his premises about the nature of definitions and causality, reinforcing his argument for God's unity by showing that a necessarily existent being cannot be multiple without contradicting the requirement that its nature explains its existence. Quote 34. Therefore, there only follows the existence of a single God, which was to be proved. This final statement encapsulates Spinoza's argument for the unity of God, summarizing the logical flow from the premises he has set forth. He asserts that the necessity of God's existence, combined with the impossibility of multiple necessary beings without external causation, logically entails that only one God exists, This is a key philosophical assertion that has significant implications for his broader metaphysical system. Quote 35. I do not know whether you have quite forgotten me, but there are many circumstances which lead me to suspect it. Spinoza opens his letter to I. Bresser with a personal reflection, expressing concern that Bresser may have forgotten him due to a lack of recent communication. This introduction sets a tone of friendly familiarity and concern, indicative of the personal relationships Spinoza maintained within his philosophical exchanges. Quote 36. Meanwhile, I should like to ask you, nay, I do beg and entreat you by our friendship, to apply yourself to some serious work with real study, and to devote the chief part of your life to the cultivation of your understanding and your soul. Here, Spinoza urges Bresser to dedicate himself to serious intellectual and spiritual development. This plea highlights Spinoza's belief in the importance of continual self-improvement and philosophical inquiry as essential pursuits for a fulfilling life. Quote 37. If you wish this opinion of mine to be changed, you may easily change it by writing, and you can at the same time point out a means of entering into a correspondence, as we once talked of doing at your house. Spinoza indicates his willingness to rekindle their correspondence and continue their philosophical discussions. This quote underscores his value on sustained intellectual dialogue and his desire to maintain and nurture relationships through exchange of ideas. Quote 38. As regards the third part of my philosophy, I will shortly send it you, if you wish to be its transmitter, or to our friend De Vries, and, although I had settled not to send any of it till it was finished, yet, as it takes longer than I thought, I am unwilling to keep you waiting. Spinoza shares his plans regarding the dissemination of his philosophical work, reflecting his methodical approach to sharing his ideas and the value he places on the feedback and involvement of his peers in his intellectual endeavors. Quote 39. Is there, or can there be, any method by which we may, without hindrance, arrive at the knowledge of the most excellent things? Or are our minds, like our bodies, subject to the vicissitudes of circumstance, so that our thoughts are governed rather by fortune than by skill? In this inquiry from Bresser, Spinoza is challenged to address whether there is a definitive method to gain true knowledge, or if human understanding is primarily influenced by external circumstances. This question captures a central theme in philosophical inquiry about the nature of knowledge and human capability to attain it. Quote 40. This conclusion may be based simply on the consideration that one clear and distinct perception, or several such together, can be absolutely the cause of another clear and distinct perception. Spinoza argues that clear and distinct ideas can logically lead to further clear and distinct ideas, suggesting a method of reasoning that relies on the internal consistency and clarity of thought. This approach is foundational to his belief that human reason, when properly employed, can lead to true understanding, independent of external conditions. Quote 41. When Professor N.N. visited me the other day, he told me that my theologico-political treatise has been translated into Dutch, and that someone whose name he did not know was about printing it. Spinoza expresses concern upon learning that his work, the theologico-political treatise, is being translated and printed in Dutch without his consent. This revelation prompts him to take immediate action to preserve the integrity and reception of his work, highlighting the importance he places on controlling the dissemination of his philosophical ideas. Quote 42. With regard to this, I earnestly beg you to inquire carefully into the business, and, if possible, stop the printing. In this urgent request, Spinoza seeks assistance to halt the unauthorized printing of his work. His appeal underscores the potential negative consequences he foresees, such as the imposition of a ban, demonstrating his acute awareness of the political and social implications of his writings. Quote 43. One of my friends sent me a short time since a pamphlet called Homo Politicus, of which I had heard much. I have read it, and find it to be the most pernicious work which man could devise or invent. Spinoza critiques the pamphlet Homo Politicus for promoting morally corrupt practices aimed at achieving personal gain through deceit and manipulation. His strong condemnation reflects his philosophical commitment to ethical integrity and his disdain for any teachings that advocate immorality as a means to success. Quote 44. How much better and more excellent than the doctrines of the aforesaid writer are the reflections of Thales of Miletus, appears from the following. All the goods of friends, he says, are in common. Wise men are the friends of the gods, and all things belong to the gods. Therefore, all things belong to the wise. Spinoza contrasts the negative teachings of Homo Politicus with the philosophical reflections of Thales of Miletus, who he praises for his noble approach to wisdom and wealth. This comparison highlights Spinoza's admiration for philosophical ideals that promote communal sharing and intellectual enrichment over materialistic pursuits. Quote 45. For when his friends reproached him with his poverty, he answered, "Do you wish me to show you that I could acquire what I deem unworthy of my labor, but you so diligently seek?" This anecdote about Thales demonstrates his ability to acquire wealth if he so chose, using his knowledge as an astrologer to make a profit from olive presses. Thales's story, as relayed by Spinoza, serves as an example of living by principles that prioritize intellectual and ethical richness over financial gain, embodying the philosophical virtues that Spinoza himself espouses. Quote 46. Most learned sir, you doubtless wonder why I have kept you so long waiting. I could hardly bring myself to reply to the pamphlet of that person, which you thought fit to send me. Indeed, I only do so now because of my promise. Spinoza opens his letter to Isaac Orobio by acknowledging the delay in his response to a contentious pamphlet, highlighting his reluctance to engage with what he perceives as a misinterpretation of his work. This sets the context for his defensive stance throughout the letter, underlining the tension between his philosophical assertions and the criticisms they have attracted. Quote 47. First he says that it is of little moment to know what nation I belong to or what sort of life I lead. Truly, if he had known, he would not so easily have persuaded himself that I teach atheism. Spinoza addresses accusations of atheism by suggesting that a proper understanding of his personal and ethical life would counter such claims. This defense reflects his belief that personal integrity and philosophical positions are deeply intertwined, and misconceptions about one can lead to errors about the other. Quote 48. What this writer means by religion, and what by superstition, I know not. But I would ask, whether a man throws off all religion, who maintains that God must be acknowledged as the highest good, and must, as such, be loved with a free mind? Here, Spinoza challenges the claim that his philosophical views amount to irreligion, asserting instead that his advocacy for a rational and free love of God as the highest good constitutes a genuine religious attitude. This response underscores his effort to distinguish his views from superstition and to define religion in terms of ethical and intellectual freedom. Quote 49. He goes on to say, in order to shun the reproach of superstition, he seems to me to have thrown off all religion. Spinoza quotes his critic to argue against the misconception that his philosophical approach, which avoids superstition, is equivalent to discarding religion entirely. He uses this to clarify his position that true religion is not about blind faith or fear-driven practices, but about understanding and loving God freely. Quote 50. This inevitable necessity in things destroys neither divine laws nor human. For moral principles, whether they have received from God the form of laws or not, are nevertheless divine and salutary. Spinoza defends his determinist view against accusations that it negates the role of divine or human laws by arguing that necessity does not undermine the moral value of actions. He maintains that moral principles are inherently divine, whether or not they are formally expressed as laws, and that they remain effective and necessary despite the deterministic nature of the universe. Quote 51. Wherefore the assertion is false, that I maintain that there is no room left for precepts and commands. Or, as he goes on to say, that there is no expectation of reward or punishment, since all things are ascribed to fate, and are said to flow with inevitable necessity from God. Spinoza refutes the claim that his philosophy leaves no space for moral guidance or the consequences of actions. He clarifies that while he believes everything follows from divine necessity, this does not exclude the reality of moral choices or their impacts, asserting that divine providence and human freedom are compatible within his framework. Quote 52. As regards political theories, the difference which you inquire about between Hobbes and myself consists in this, that I always preserve natural right intact, and only allot to the chief magistrates in every state a right over their subjects, commensurate with the excess of their power over the power of the subjects. Spinoza clarifies the key distinction between his political philosophy and that of Thomas Hobbes. While Hobbes emphasizes the absolute surrender of natural rights to a sovereign for security and order, Spinoza maintains that natural rights remain intact and that the authority of rulers should be proportionate to their ability to exceed the power of the subjects. This fundamental difference underscores Spinoza's commitment to a form of governance that respects individual rights, while Hobbes's model prioritizes state control and security. Quote 53. Again, with regard to the demonstration which I establish in the appendix to my geometric exposition of Cartesian principles, namely, that God can only with great impropriety be called one or single, I answer that a thing can only be called one or single in respect of existence, not in respect of essence. Spinoza discusses the concept of unity in relation to God, arguing that it is improper to describe God as one or single if considering only the essence rather than existence. He explains that numerical identifiers like one or single apply to concepts that can be grouped under a common genus, which is not applicable to God's unique and infinite nature. This statement highlights Spinoza's nuanced understanding of God, differing from traditional monotheistic views which straightforwardly label God as one. Quote 54. As to the doctrine that figure is negation and not anything positive, it is plain that the whole of matter considered indefinitely can have no figure, and that figure can only exist in finite and determinate bodies. Here, Spinoza addresses the philosophical concept of figure, explaining it as a form of negation rather than a positive property. He argues that figure emerges from the limitation or determination of bodies, implying that infinite or indefinite matter cannot possess a figure. This perspective offers insight into his broader metaphysical views on substance and form, where form results from limitation and thus does not pertain to the essence of a substance. Quote 55. The book, which a Utrecht professor wrote against mine, and which was published after his death, I saw lying in a bookseller's window. From the little I then read of it, I judged it unworthy of perusal, still less of reply. Spinoza dismisses a critique of his work published posthumously by a Utrecht professor, expressing disdain for the quality of the argument and choosing not to engage with it further. This reaction reflects his confidence in his own philosophical positions and his decision to ignore what he considers uninformed or inadequate criticisms. Quote 56. With an inward smile, I reflected that the most ignorant are ever the most audacious, and the most ready to rush into print. Spinoza comments wryly on the tendency of the least knowledgeable individuals to be the most bold in publishing their opinions, indicating a critical view of premature scholarly publications. This observation underscores his belief in thoughtful and well-founded intellectual discourse, contrasting with practices he sees as driven by ignorance or audacity rather than genuine insight. Quote 57. Most learned and distinguished sir, I have read the paper you were kind enough to send me, and return you many thanks for the communication. Spinoza opens his letter to Leibniz with gratitude, acknowledging the receipt of a paper from Leibniz. This expression of thanks sets a respectful and collegial tone for their correspondence, reflecting Spinoza's appreciation for intellectual exchange with other prominent thinkers of his time. Quote 58. I regret that I have not been able quite to follow your meaning, though you explain it sufficiently clearly. Whether you think that there is any cause for making the apertures of the glasses small, except that the rays coming from a single point are not collected accurately at another single point, but in a small area which we generally call the mechanical point. Spinoza articulates a specific technical query regarding Leibniz's explanation of the optical properties of lenses, particularly about the size of apertures and their effect on the focus of light rays. This inquiry highlights Spinoza's keen interest in the details of optical science, a field in which he was both theoretically and practically engaged, especially in lens grinding. Quote 59. Further, I ask whether the lenses which you call pandoche correct this fault, so that the mechanical point or small area on which the rays coming from a single point are after refraction collected always preserves the same proportional size, whether the aperture be small or large. Here, Spinoza seeks further clarification on the function of the pandoche lenses described by Leibniz. His question is focused on whether these lenses can maintain consistent focus across different aperture sizes, showing his deep understanding of optical principles and his critical approach to new scientific claims. Quote 60. If so, one may enlarge the aperture as much as one likes, and consequently these lenses will be far superior to those of any other shape known to me. If not, I hardly see why you praise them so greatly beyond common lenses. Spinoza expresses a conditional assessment of the pandoche lenses, noting that their superiority over conventional lenses hinges on their performance under varying conditions. His commentary reflects a rational skepticism and a demand for empirical verification before accepting new scientific ideas. Quote 61. I have not yet seen the Prodromo of Francis Lana, nor the physico-mechanical reflections of John Oltius. Spinoza mentions his lack of access to certain scientific works, highlighting his continual pursuit of knowledge and his desire to stay informed about contemporary scientific discussions. This shows his active engagement with the scientific community and his eagerness to explore new ideas. Quote 62. The gift, therefore, which you so liberally promised me, will be most acceptable to me. If I can be of use to you in any other matter, you will always find me most ready. Spinoza expresses his anticipation and gratitude in advance for a promised gift from Leibniz, likely a scientific text or manuscript. He reciprocates by offering his assistance in other matters, demonstrating his generosity and willingness to support mutual intellectual endeavors. Quote 63. Distinguished Sir, if I had ever desired to take a professorship in any faculty, I could not have wished for any other than that which is offered to me through you, by His Most Serene Highness, the Elector Palatine, especially because of that freedom in philosophical teaching, which the most gracious Prince is kind enough to grant, not to speak of the desire which I have long entertained, to live under the rule of a prince, whom all men admire for his wisdom. Spinoza begins his letter to Fabritius by acknowledging a generous offer for a professorship from the Elector Palatine, noting the appealing conditions of freedom in philosophical teaching, and the honor of serving under a respected ruler. This introduction sets a tone of gratitude and respect, while also hinting at his reservations about accepting the position. Quote 64. But since it has never been my wish to teach in public, I have been unable to induce myself to accept this splendid opportunity, though I have long deliberated about it. Here, Spinoza expresses his reluctance to teach publicly, despite the attractiveness of the offer. This statement reveals his preference for private study and introspection over public engagement, reflecting his personal values and lifestyle choices that prioritize intellectual independence and privacy. Quote 65. I think in the first place that I should abandon philosophical research if I consented to find time for teaching young students. Spinoza shares his concern that accepting a teaching position would detract from his own philosophical research. This concern highlights his deep commitment to his intellectual pursuits and suggests that his professional decisions are strongly guided by the potential impact on his personal scholarly work. Quote 66. I think, in the second place, that I do not know the limits within which the freedom of my philosophical teaching would be confined, if I am to avoid all appearance of disturbing the publicly established religion. Spinoza expresses uncertainty about the extent of the promised freedom in teaching, particularly regarding the boundaries that might be imposed to prevent conflict with established religious doctrines. This uncertainty underscores his caution about entering into a role that could constrain his philosophical expression or embroil him in religious controversy. Quote 67. Thus you see, distinguished sir, that I am not holding back in the hope of getting something better, but through my love of quietness, which I think I can in some measure secure if I keep away from lecturing in public. Spinoza clarifies that his hesitation to accept the professorship is not due to ambition or a desire for a better offer, but is driven by his love of tranquility and his preference for a private life. This personal insight into his motivations provides a clearer understanding of his character and philosophical disposition, emphasizing his valuation of peace and intellectual freedom over public recognition or professional advancement. Quote 68. Dear Sir, your letter, which I received yesterday, was most welcome to me, both because I wanted to hear news of you, and also because it shows that you have not utterly forgotten me. Spinoza expresses his pleasure at receiving correspondence from Hugo Boxall, reflecting his value on maintaining relationships and engaging in intellectual discussions. This sentiment highlights his appreciation for continued dialogue and connection, even when discussing contentious topics such as the existence of ghosts, which forms the main subject of their exchange. Quote 69. Although some might think it a bad omen that ghosts are the cause of your writing to me, I, on the contrary, can discern a deeper meaning in the circumstance. I see that not only truths, but also things trifling and imaginary may be of use to me. In this response, Spinoza humorously acknowledges the unusual topic of ghosts as the catalyst for their communication, but suggests that even seemingly trivial or imaginary subjects can hold value. This statement reflects his philosophical openness to exploring various ideas and using them to enrich his own understanding, regardless of their conventional significance. Quote 70. However, let us defer the question whether ghosts are delusions and imaginary, for I see that not only denial of them, but even doubt about them seems very singular to you, as to one who has been convinced by the numerous histories related by men of today and the ancients. Spinoza tactfully proposes to postpone the debate on the reality of ghosts, recognizing that Boxall holds strong convictions supported by historical accounts. This approach demonstrates Spinoza's respect for differing viewpoints and his strategic choice to engage thoughtfully rather than confrontationally. Quote 71. The great esteem and honor in which I have always held and still hold you does not suffer me to contradict you, still less to humor you. Spinoza expresses deep respect for Boxall, stating that his regard prevents him from merely contradicting or pandering to him. This declaration underscores Spinoza's commitment to sincere and respectful dialogue, valuing honest exchange over mere agreement. Quote 72. Pray tell me, my dear sir, before I explain myself further in the matter, what are these ghosts or specters? Are they children, or fools, or madmen? Spinoza challenges Boxall to define precisely what he means by ghosts or specters, questioning whether the commonly reported phenomena are akin to the fancies of children, fools, or the mentally unwell. This request for clarification shows Spinoza's methodical approach to discussion, seeking clear definitions to avoid misunderstandings and to address the topic rigorously. Quote 73. That the desire which most men have to narrate things, not as they really happened, but as they wished them to happen, can be illustrated from the stories of ghosts and specters more easily than from any others. Spinoza critiques the reliability of ghost stories, suggesting that they often reflect more about the storyteller's desires or fears than about factual occurrences. This observation points to his skepticism about subjective narratives and his preference for more empirical or rational approaches to understanding phenomena. Quote 74. However, let us descend to created things, which are all determined by external causes to exist and operate in a given determinate manner. Spinoza extends his argument about necessity and freedom to all created beings, stating that their existence and actions are determined by external causes. This assertion underscores his deterministic view of the universe, where everything follows from some prior cause, leaving little room for the kind of free will that involves spontaneous decision-making. Quote 75. Thus, an infant believes that it desires milk freely. An angry child thinks he wishes freely for vengeance. A timid child thinks he wishes freely to run away. Spinoza uses examples of common human experiences to illustrate how people believe themselves to be free because they are aware of their desires, but not the causes that determine those desires. This helps clarify his point that what we often consider free will is actually the result of unseen deterministic processes. Quote 76. As this misconception is innate in all men, it is not easily conquered. For although experience abundantly shows that men can do anything rather than check their desires, and that very often, when a prey to conflicting emotions, they see the better course and follow the worse, they yet believe themselves to be free. Spinoza comments on the persistence of the belief in free will despite evidence to the contrary, where individuals fail to control their actions even when they know better. He suggests that the innate human tendency to feel free is a deep-seated illusion, difficult to overcome even with direct experience of one's own limitations. Quote 77. I have thus, if I mistake not, sufficiently explained my opinion regarding free and constrained necessity, and also regarding so-called human freedom. From what I have said, you will easily be able to reply to your friend's objections. Spinoza concludes his explanation of his views on necessity and freedom, confident that he has provided enough information for Schuller to address any objections his friend might have. This demonstrates Spinoza's methodical approach to philosophical discourse, aiming to clarify his ideas sufficiently so others can engage with and defend them effectively. Quote 78. The organization of the Roman Church, which you so greatly praise, I confess to be politic, and to many lucrative. I should believe that there was no other more convenient for deceiving the people and keeping men's minds in check, if it were not for the organization of the Mahometan Church, which far surpasses it. Spinoza critically assesses the structure of the Roman Church, acknowledging its political and financial astuteness while implying it serves more to control and deceive the populace than to foster genuine faith or enlightenment. He contrasts it with the organization of the Islamic tradition, which he suggests is even more effective in such control. Quote 79. If, therefore, you had rightly judged, you would have seen that only your third point tells in favor of the Christians, namely, that unlearned and common men should have been able to convert nearly the whole world to a belief in Christ. Spinoza challenges the argument that the success of Christianity's spread is a proof of its divine truth, suggesting that the ability of ordinary people to persuade others to their faith might be impressive, but does not necessarily validate the religion's ultimate truth or superiority. Quote 80. Do you think that you can thereby prove mathematically the authority of that church? As the case is far otherwise, why do you wish me to believe that my demonstrations are inspired by the prince of evil spirits, while your own are inspired by God, especially as I see, and as your letter clearly shows, that you have been led to become a devotee of this church not by your love of God, but by your fear of hell, the single cause of superstition? Here, Spinoza questions the logical foundation of claiming the Roman Church's authority is divinely inspired and criticizes the motivations behind such beliefs as rooted in fear rather than genuine faith or rational understanding. Quote 81. Is this your humility, that you trust nothing to yourself, but everything to others, who are condemned by many of their fellow men? Do you set it down to pride and arrogance, that I employ reason and acquiesce in this true word of God, which is in the mind and can never be depraved or corrupted? Spinoza critiques the abandonment of personal judgment and reason in favor of blind adherence to religious authority, advocating instead for the use of reason as a path to understanding divine truth, which he argues is uncorruptible and inherent in the human mind. Quote 82. Cast away this deadly superstition, acknowledge the reason which God has given you, and follow that, unless you would be numbered with the brutes. In this forceful admonition, Spinoza urges the rejection of superstition in favor of embracing reason, which he sees as a divine gift essential for true understanding and human dignity. He positions reason as the key to elevating oneself above mere animal existence and towards a more enlightened state. Quote 83. Sir, our friend, J.R., has sent me the letter which you have been kind enough to write to me, and also the judgment of your friend as to the opinions of Descartes and myself regarding free will. Both enclosures were very welcome to me. Spinoza begins his correspondence with Schuller by expressing appreciation for the letters and discussions regarding free will, a central theme in philosophical debate. This introduction sets the stage for a thoughtful discourse on the differences between his and Descartes' views on freedom and determinism. Quote 84. As for his statement that if we were constrained by external causes, no one could acquire the habit of virtue, I know not what is his authority for saying that firmness and constancy of disposition cannot arise from predestined necessity, but only from free will. Spinoza challenges the idea that virtue and moral character require free will in the conventional sense. He argues that virtues can be developed from necessity through the inevitable unfolding of one's nature and circumstances, rather than from freely choosing to act virtuously. Quote 85. What he finally adds, that if this were granted, all wickedness would be excusable. I meet with the question, what then? Wicked men are not less to be feared, and are not less harmful when they are wicked from necessity. In response to the argument that excusing wrongdoing on the basis of determinism would lead to moral chaos, Spinoza contends that understanding actions as determined does not mitigate the harm they can cause or the need to address such behaviors effectively within society. This highlights his pragmatic approach to ethics and law, grounded in an understanding of human behavior as determined yet still requiring responsible management. Quote 86. Sir, our friend, J.R., has sent me the letter which you have been kind enough to write to me, and also the judgment of your friend as to the opinions of Descartes and myself regarding free will. Both enclosures were very welcome to me. Spinoza begins his letter to Schuller by expressing his appreciation for the communications he received, which discuss the philosophical topic of free will, specifically comparing his views to those of Descartes. This appreciation sets the tone for a thoughtful discourse on a deeply philosophical issue that both interests and engages Spinoza, despite his other preoccupations and health issues. Quote 87. I say that a thing is free, which exists and acts solely by the necessity of its own nature. Thus also God understands himself and all things freely, because it follows solely from the necessity of his nature, that he should understand all things. Here, Spinoza outlines his definition of freedom, which is fundamentally different from common interpretations. He argues that true freedom is the result of acting according to the necessity of one's own nature rather than through choice. He extends this concept to God, suggesting that God's understanding of himself and everything else is an expression of divine necessity, thereby framing freedom as an intrinsic expression of essence rather than an exertion of will. Quote 88. Further conceive, I beg, that a stone, while continuing in motion, should be capable of thinking and knowing that it is endeavoring, as far as it can, to continue to move. Such a stone, being conscious merely of its own endeavor and not at all indifferent, would believe itself to be completely free, and would think that it continued in motion solely because of its own wish. This analogy illustrates Spinoza's perspective on human understanding of free will. He compares humans to a stone that, if it could think, would mistakenly believe its motion to be a result of its own volition. This serves to highlight his view that what humans perceive as free will is merely a misunderstanding of the causes that determine their actions. Quote 89. This is that human freedom, which all boast that they possess, and which consists solely in the fact that men are conscious of their own desire, but are ignorant of the causes whereby that desire has been determined. Spinoza argues that conventional notions of freedom are illusory. He claims that humans feel free because they are aware of their desires, but remain unaware of the myriad external factors that dictate these desires. This insight challenges the belief in free will by suggesting that true autonomy might be an illusion, given our ignorance of the deeper causes influencing our decisions. Quote 90. For, although experience abundantly shows that men can do anything rather than check their desires, and that very often, when a prey to conflicting emotions, they see the better course and follow the worse, they yet believe themselves to be free, because in some cases their desire for a thing is slight and can easily be overruled by the recollection of something else, which is frequently present in the mind. Spinoza observes that despite frequent experiences where individuals fail to control their actions, they continue to believe in their freedom. He suggests that this belief persists because, in less intense desires, people can change their minds easily, mistaking this ability for freedom, rather than recognizing the deeper, often uncontrollable forces at play. This point further illustrates his argument that human freedom is a complex and often misunderstood phenomenon. Quote 91. Honored Sir, between a true and an adequate idea, I recognize no difference, except that the epithet true only has regard to the agreement between the idea and its object, whereas the epithet adequate has regard to the nature of the idea in itself, so that in reality there is no difference between a true and an adequate idea beyond this extrinsic relation. Spinoza clarifies his philosophical terminology by distinguishing between true and adequate ideas. He explains that a true idea corresponds accurately to its object, while an adequate idea fully captures the essence of its subject internally. This differentiation is crucial for understanding Spinoza's approach to ideas and knowledge, emphasizing that while all adequate ideas are true, their adequacy is derived from their comprehensive nature within the mind itself. Quote 92. Dear Sir, I am glad that you have at last had occasion to refresh me with one of your letters, always most welcome to me. I heartily beg that you will frequently repeat the favor, etc. Spinoza expresses his pleasure at receiving correspondence from Schuller, emphasizing the value he places on their ongoing exchange of ideas. His response illustrates his commitment to maintaining intellectual relationships and his appreciation for thoughtful dialogue, which he views as enriching and essential to his work. Quote 93. I proceed to consider your doubts. To the first, I answer that the human mind can only acquire knowledge of those things which the idea of a body actually existing involves, or of what can be inferred from such an idea. Spinoza addresses the limitations of human understanding, clarifying that knowledge is confined to the ideas of existing bodies and what can logically be deduced from them. This statement underscores his philosophical stance that the scope of human cognition is inherently limited by the nature of the physical world and our perceptual abilities within it. Quote 94. For the power of anything is defined solely by its essence. The essence of the mind consists solely in this, that it is the idea of body actually existing. Therefore, the mind's power of understanding only extends to things which this idea of body contains in itself, or which follow therefrom. Here, Spinoza delineates the relationship between the essence of the mind and its capacity to understand, positing that the mind is intrinsically linked to the physical form it perceives and can only grasp what is presented through this form. This philosophical viewpoint highlights his deterministic view of human cognition, where understanding is not an open-ended capacity, but one bound by the specifics of its object, the human body. Quote 95. It is therefore plain that the human mind, or the idea of the human body, neither involves nor expresses any attributes to God save these two. Spinoza concludes that the human mind, through its understanding of the body, can only conceive of God in terms of extension and thought. This narrow view challenges broader theological interpretations, suggesting that our perception of divinity is constrained by our sensory and cognitive architecture. Quote 96. Moreover, this proposition might be proved more readily by a reduction to the absurd. I am accustomed, when the proposition is negative, to employ this mode of demonstration as more in character. Spinoza hints at his methodological preference for using reductio ad absurdum, especially in negating propositions, to illustrate the logical inconsistencies that would arise from accepting certain premises. This approach reveals his commitment to rigorous logical reasoning in philosophical argumentation, valuing clarity and logical integrity in exploring complex ideas. Quote 97. The sense in which I mean that God is the efficient cause of things, no less of their essence than of their existence, I think, has been sufficiently explained. In asserting that God is the efficient cause of both the essence and existence of things, Spinoza intertwines the concepts of causality and divine action, proposing a unified view of existence where God's influence is both foundational and pervasive. This reflects his monistic philosophy, where God and nature are seen as two names for one reality, encompassing all substance and change. Quote 98. Distinguished Sir, my statement concerning the infinite, that an infinity of parts cannot be inferred from a multitude of parts, is plain when we consider that if such a conclusion could be drawn from a multitude of parts, we should not be able to imagine a greater multitude of parts. The first-named multitude, whatever it was, would have to be the greater, which is contrary to fact. Spinoza addresses the concept of infinity in relation to the physical division of space, arguing that the infinite cannot be simply deduced from the finite or the countable. His explanation challenges the intuitive notion that a larger number of parts automatically suggests an infinite division, highlighting the logical and philosophical complexities involved in understanding infinity. Quote 99. For in the whole space between two non-concentric circles, we conceive a greater multitude of parts than in half that space, yet the number of parts in the half, as in the whole of the space, exceeds any assignable number. Here, Spinoza uses the example of non-concentric circles to further illustrate the problem of discussing infinity in terms of finite divisions. He points out that although one can conceptually divide space into increasingly smaller parts, this division does not straightforwardly lead to a true concept of infinity, since each division, no matter how small, is still finite. Quote 100. Again, from extension, as Descartes conceives it, to wit, a quiescent mass, it is not only difficult, as you say, but absolutely impossible to prove the existence of bodies. Spinoza critiques Descartes' concept of matter as merely extension or a passive substance, arguing that this definition fails to adequately account for the active properties of physical bodies, such as their ability to initiate motion. This statement reflects his deeper metaphysical commitment to a more dynamic understanding of substance. Quote 101. For matter at rest, as it is in itself, will continue at rest, and will only be determined to motion by some more powerful external cause. For this reason, I have not hesitated on a former occasion to affirm that the Cartesian principles of natural things are useless, not to say absurd. Spinoza argues against the Cartesian principle that matter is fundamentally inert, asserting that such a view renders the principles governing physical phenomena ineffective or even absurd. He challenges the notion that matter at rest stays at rest unless acted upon, suggesting instead a more complex interaction of forces that Descartes' mechanical philosophy fails to capture. Quote 102. With regard to your question as to whether the variety of the universe can be deduced a priori from the conception of extension only, I believe I have shown clearly enough already that it cannot, and that therefore matter has been ill-defined by Descartes as extension. It must necessarily be explained through an attribute which expresses eternal and infinite essence. Spinoza addresses the limitations of Descartes' definition of matter, arguing that a true understanding of the universe's diversity cannot be derived just from the concept of extension. He proposes that matter should instead be understood through attributes that convey its eternal and infinite essence, which is a more holistic approach that includes dynamic and intrinsic properties, not just static extension. Quote 103. That, which I could scarcely believe when told me by others, I learn at last from your own letter. Not only have you been made a member of the Romish Church, but you are become a very keen champion of the same, and have already learned wantonly to insult and rail against your opponents. Spinoza expresses his disbelief and disappointment upon learning about his pupil, Albert Berg, converting to and fervently supporting the Roman Catholic Church. His response highlights his concern not only with the conversion itself, but with the aggressive manner in which Berg has begun to defend his new beliefs, indicating a dramatic change in character and approach. Quote 104. I will not imitate those adversaries of Romanism who would set forth the vices of priests and popes with a view to kindling your aversion. Such considerations are often put forward from evil and unworthy motives, and tend rather to irritate than to instruct. In this passage, Spinoza declares his intent to avoid common criticisms of the Roman Catholic Church that focus on the moral failings of its clergy. He aims to maintain a high level of discourse, suggesting that personal attacks do not contribute to understanding or resolving theological and philosophical disputes. This approach reflects his commitment to rational debate over emotive or ad hominem arguments. Quote 105. As it is by this that we know that we dwell in God, and He in us. 1 John 13. It follows that what distinguishes the Roman Church from others must be something entirely superfluous, and therefore founded solely on superstition. Here, Spinoza argues that the true essence of Christian faith, which should be marked by justice and charity as signs of God's presence, does not support the exclusive claims of the Roman Church to spiritual authority. He suggests that any distinction it claims over other Christian denominations must therefore be based on unnecessary or superstitious elements, not on fundamental religious truths. Quote 106. But I return to your letter, which you begin, by lamenting that I allow myself to be ensnared by the prince of evil spirits. Pray, take heart, and recollect yourself. Spinoza addresses Berg's accusation that he is misled by evil influences, countering that it is Berg who has lost touch with reason and the principles they once shared. Spinoza's response is both a rebuke and a call for self-reflection, urging his former pupil to reconsider the basis of his new convictions in light of their shared intellectual background. Quote 107. Yet you seem to wish to employ reason, and ask me, how I know that my philosophy is the best among all that have ever been taught in the world, or are being taught, or ever will be taught. A question which I might with much greater right ask you. Spinoza challenges Berg's questioning of his philosophical certainties by turning the question back on Berg, questioning the foundation of his newfound religious certainty. This rhetorical move underscores Spinoza's confidence in his own rational, philosophical approach, compared to what he perceives as Berg's baseless faith. Quote 108, "Most excellent and distinguished sir, I wonder at our friend Neustadt having said that I am meditating the refutation of the various writings circulated against my book, and that among the works for me to refute, he places your MS. For I certainly have never entertained the intention of refuting any of my adversaries. They all seem to me utterly unworthy of being answered." Spinoza expresses his surprise and clarifies his stance regarding the responses to his work, particularly the manuscript by Van Veldhuizen. He articulates a disinterest in engaging in refutation of his critics, whom he views as not meriting a response due to the perceived lack of substance in their criticisms. This quote reveals Spinoza's confidence in his own philosophical positions and his dismissive attitude towards those he considers not worth debating. Quote 109, "I do not remember to have said to Mr. Neustadt anything more than that I propose to illustrate some of the obscurer passages in the treatise with notes, and that I should add to these your MS, and my answer, if your consent could be gained, on which last point I begged him to speak to you, adding that if you refused permission on the ground that some of the observations in my answer were too harshly put, you should be given full power to modify or expunge them." Here, Spinoza outlines his intention to clarify parts of his work, Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, through annotations, and to possibly include Van Veldhuizen's manuscript with his responses, subject to Veldhuizen's approval. This proposal highlights Spinoza's openness to discourse and his respect for his interlocutor's views, even as he stands ready to critique them. It also reflects his care for intellectual fairness and his methodical approach to philosophical discussion. Quote 110, "But, to tell the truth, you would do me a far greater kindness if you would put in writing the arguments with which you think you can impugn my treatise, and add them to your MS. I most earnestly beg you to do this, for there is no one whose arguments I would more willingly consider, knowing, as I do, that you are bound solely by your zeal for truth, and that your mind is singularly candid." Spinoza sincerely requests Van Veldhuizen to articulate his criticisms more thoroughly and incorporate them into the manuscript. This invitation for a robust critique of his ideas is indicative of Spinoza's genuine engagement with differing viewpoints and his value of honest intellectual challenge as a means to truth. It shows his respect for Van Veldhuizen's intellectual integrity and his eagerness to consider thoughtful counter-arguments to refine his own philosophical positions. Letters to Friend and Foe by Baruch Spinoza reveals the consistency and clarity of his thoughts as he responds to friends and critics alike. Through these correspondences, Spinoza's advocacy for rationality, freedom of thought, and the pursuit of knowledge stands in stark contrast to the rigid dogmas of his time. The letters reflect his lifelong commitment to reason over superstition and his unwavering belief in the importance of intellectual liberty as the foundation for a more just and enlightened society.
Curious to dive into the mind of Baruch Spinoza? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Letters to Friend and Foe in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.